Nobody saw this coming. Not the politicians, not the journalists, not even the people inside the White House itself. One minute, it was a regular morning in Washington, and the next, the entire country stopped breathing because Donald Trump just did something that no sitting American president has ever done in the history of this nation. And before you assume you already know what this is, stop, because you don't. This is different. This cuts deeper. And once you understand the full weight of what just happened inside those walls, you will never look at the American presidency the same way again. Let's go back just a few hours. The White House press pool was gathered as usual. Aides were moving through the corridors. The ordinary machinery of presidential power was grinding forward. And then, without warning, without precedent, and without any constitutional roadmap to guide what came next, Trump acted alone, decisively, in a way that every president before him, from George Washington to Barack Obama to Joe Biden, chose never to do. And America is shaking, not metaphorically, not in the overheated language of cable news chyrons. Shaking, as in legal scholars are scrambling for their phones. Former White House officials are going on record with words like extraordinary and uncharted territory. Constitutional attorneys who have spent decades studying executive power are openly saying they have never seen anything like this. Not in their careers, not in their textbooks, not in the entire written history of the Republic. Now, here is why this matters so much more than the typical storm of Washington controversy. Every single day in this city, something is called unprecedented. A tweet, a policy reversal, a firing. The word gets thrown around so often it has nearly lost its meaning. But what happened today inside the White House is not a Twitter moment. It is not a political maneuver dressed up in dramatic language. What Trump did today will be studied, debated, and argued over in courtrooms and law schools for generations. Because he didn't just bend the rules. He walked into a room, looked at a line that every American president for 235 years had agreed was uncrossable, and he crossed it. Think about that for a moment. George Washington set precedents that held for centuries. Abraham Lincoln, governing through a civil war, still operated within certain understood boundaries. Franklin Roosevelt, who reshaped the presidency more than almost anyone, still stopped short of this. Richard Nixon, who pushed executive power to its most controversial limits, never went here. Reagan didn't. Clinton didn't. Even in the chaotic fever pitch of Trump's first term, he didn't go this far. Until today. Sources close to senior White House staff describe the atmosphere inside the building as tense and electric in equal measure. Some aides are reportedly stunned. Others, those who have been with Trump since the early days of the second term, are calling it bold, calling it exactly what they elected him to do. But even among his supporters, there is a quiet recognition that a door has just been opened that may be impossible to close. Because that is the nature of presidential precedent. Once a president does something, the office is forever changed. Future presidents will point to today. They will say it has already been done. They will use this moment as the justification for things we cannot yet imagine. The gravity of what happened this morning is not just about Trump. It is about every president who comes after him. It is about what kind of institution the American presidency will be for the next 100 years. And the reaction is already spreading far beyond Washington. Foreign governments are watching. Allies are being briefed. The United Nations floor is buzzing with quiet but urgent conversations. Because what a president does inside the White House does not stay inside the White House. It echoes outward. It shifts calculations in capitals around the world. It tells every nation watching. And every nation is always watching. Something fundamental about the direction of American power. Back home, the response is splitting along the exact lines you would expect in today's America, but with something different underneath. Even the voices that typically rush to defend every Trump decision are measured today. Careful, because defending something no one has ever done before requires a different kind of argument. It requires you to look the country in the eye and say that the rules which held this office together for over 2 centuries no longer apply. And that is a heavy thing to say out loud. The lawyers are already preparing. The calls to Congress have already started. And somewhere right now, in a federal court that will soon find this case on its docket, a judge is about to read a brief that will make history. Washington has seen scandals. It has seen power grabs. It has seen presidents test every limit of their authority. But it has never seen a day quite like today. There is a specific kind of silence that falls over Washington when something truly historic happens. Not the performative quiet of a staged ceremony, not the rehearsed pause before a prepared announcement. A real silence. The kind that spreads from room to room, from aide to aide, from phone call to phone call, as people slowly process the fact that something has just changed and there is no going back. That silence fell over the White House today, and the reason for it will be written into the history of this country long after the news cycle has moved on. For 235 years, the American presidency has operated inside a set of understood boundaries. Some of those boundaries are written into the Constitution, some are encoded in federal law. But many of the most important ones, the ones that have actually held this office together across centuries of war, crisis, scandal, and transformation, exist in a different place entirely. They exist in the collective judgment of the men who have held this office before. In the conscious, deliberate choices of presidents who looked at certain lines and decided, each one in their own time, that crossing them would cost the Republic more than any short-term gain was worth. Those choices built something. They built a tradition, a guardrail, an unspoken agreement between the presidency and the American people that power, however vast, has edges. Donald Trump crossed one of those edges today. And what makes this moment so different from every other time that phrase has been uttered about this president is the reaction coming from the people who study these things most seriously. Not television commentators racing to fill airtime, not opposition politicians doing what opposition politicians always do. Constitutional scholars, people who have spent their entire professional lives mapping the legal geography of executive authority, are using language today that they have never used before. Words like irreversible, words like structural, words that signal they are not talking about a controversy that will fade in a week, but about a shift in the architecture of American governance itself. Because that is precisely what presidential precedent does. It does not merely describe what one man chose to do on one particular morning. It redefines what the office is. It rewrites the operating manual for every person who will ever sit behind that desk in the future. When a president does something for the first time and is not stopped by the courts, by Congress, by the weight of public outrage, that thing becomes possible. It becomes available. It becomes, in the cold logic of political power, a tool. And tools, once forged, do not disappear simply because the hand that made them leaves office. Every president before Trump understood this. George Washington understood it so deeply that he voluntarily surrendered power in ways that were not legally required of him, precisely because he knew the choices he made would echo forward. Abraham Lincoln, governing through the most violent rupture in American history, still moved carefully around certain executive boundaries, aware that what he normalized in crisis would be inherited by presidents governing in peace. Franklin Roosevelt, whose 4 terms and wartime authority expanded the presidency further than almost any figure in history, was himself constrained by a quiet internal calculus about which lines, if crossed, would damage something more important than any single policy victory. That calculus, that restraint, is what was absent today. And its absence is what has legal Washington in the state it is currently in. There are former White House counsels on the phone right now with sitting senators. There are federal judges reading briefs that were filed within hours of this morning's events. There are constitutional law professors who have already canceled their afternoon classes because what happened today demands to be taught in real time, not from a textbook written years from now. That is not the landscape of a routine political controversy. That is the landscape of a genuine inflection point, and a moment when the country looks at its own institutions and asks with genuine uncertainty whether those institutions are still what everyone believed them to be yesterday. What Trump did today was not impulsive. It was not accidental. The people around him knew what they were doing and chose to do it anyway. And that deliberateness is perhaps the most significant detail in this entire story. Because impulsive actions can be walked back, accidents can be corrected. But a deliberate crossing of a line that has stood for 2.5 centuries, done with full awareness of its weight, done with the machinery of the executive branch behind it, that is a statement, a declaration. It says plainly and without ambiguity that the rules which govern this office for every president in American history will not govern this one. And the country is sitting with that statement right now, trying to understand what it means for everything that comes next. Power never stays where it begins. That is one of the oldest lessons in the study of governance, and it is a lesson that Washington, for all its cynicism and institutional memory, seems to forget every time it is tested. What a president does inside the White House does not remain inside the White House. It travels, it mutates, it arrives in places no one anticipated, wearing shapes no one predicted, carrying consequences that stretch so far beyond the original moment that the original moment itself becomes almost unrecognizable by the time the full weight of it is finally understood. That is where America finds itself today. Not simply reacting to one decision made by one man on one morning, but staring down the corridor of time, trying to see what this moment becomes when it is no longer today, when the news cycle has moved on and the cameras have pointed elsewhere, and what was done inside those walls has quietly, permanently reshaped the landscape of American power. The first ripple is already visible in Washington itself. Congress, which has spent years in a complicated and often paralyzed relationship with this White House, is now being forced into a position it has desperately tried to avoid. Because what happened today is not something that can be met with a strongly worded statement or a committee hearing that disappears into procedural delay. What happened today puts a direct question on the table for every elected representative in this country. And that question demands an answer that cannot be walked back or softened into ambiguity. Either the legislature moves to respond with the full authority it possesses under the Constitution, or it signals to this president, to future presidents, and to every foreign government watching that the American system of checks and balances will yield under sufficient pressure. Both answers carry consequences. Neither answer is comfortable, and Capitol Hill knows it. Hill knows. The second ripple is moving through the federal court system with a speed that is itself remarkable. Filings that would normally take weeks to assemble have appeared within hours. Judges who typically operate with careful, deliberate restraint are being asked to move at a pace the judicial system rarely tolerates, because the people bringing these cases understand that delay is its own kind of answer. Every day that passes without a legal check on what was done today is another day that the action settles further into the landscape of executive normalcy. The courts are being asked not just to rule on a legal question, but to decide how quickly the law is willing to defend itself. And the pressure on those courtrooms right now is unlike anything most sitting federal judges have experienced in their careers. But perhaps the most consequential ripple is the one that is hardest to see from inside the country, because it is moving through diplomatic channels and foreign intelligence briefings and private conversations between heads of state that will never appear in any press release. America's allies are watching, not with the open alarm they might express publicly, but with the quiet recalibrating attention of governments that have built decades of policy around a certain understanding of what the United States is and how it behaves. Every alliance, every treaty, every security arrangement that America has constructed since the Second World War rests on a foundation that includes, as one of its essential stones, a belief in the stability and predictability of American institutions. When those institutions visibly bend, that foundation develops cracks, and foreign governments do not need those cracks to be large before they begin quietly adjusting their calculations. America's adversaries, meanwhile, are not being quiet about their attention at all. In capitals that have spent years probing for weakness in the American system, today is being processed with considerable interest. Not because any single domestic action in Washington changes the military or economic balance of global power overnight, but because moments like this one carry a signal that travels further and faster than any official statement. The signal is about institutional confidence, about whether the rules that govern the most powerful office on earth are stable or negotiable. And that signal, once sent, is very difficult to unsend. Then there is the dimension that lives beyond all the legal analysis and geopolitical calculation. The dimension that belongs simply to the American people and to their relationship with the office of the presidency itself. Trust in institutions is not a fixed quantity. It is built slowly, across generations, through consistent behavior that affirms certain values and upholds certain expectations. And it is damaged quickly, in single moments, when something happens that cannot be squared with what people believed the institution to be. What Trump did today has introduced a question into the minds of millions of Americans that was not there yesterday. Not a partisan question, not a question about policy or ideology, a deeper question about whether the boundaries they were taught to believe in were ever as solid as they appeared. That question does not dissolve when the news moves on. It lives in the culture. It shapes how the next generation understands power. It changes what future presidents believe they are permitted to attempt. And it alters, in ways that will take years to fully measure, what it means to govern the most powerful nation on earth. There are moments in the life of a nation that do not announce themselves clearly. They do not arrive with trumpets or formal declarations. They slip into history quietly, disguised as a single morning's news. And it is only later, sometimes years later, sometimes decades, that people look back and recognize the moment for what it truly was: a turning point, a before and after. A line in the national story where everything that follows is measurably different from everything that came before. America is living inside one of those moments right now, and the difficulty is that most people caught inside a historic moment cannot fully see its shape while they are standing in it. But some things are already clear, and clarity, even partial clarity, is worth holding on to when the ground beneath an institution is shifting. What became clear today is that the American presidency, the most studied, most debated, most carefully constructed executive office in the history of modern democracy, is not as protected by its own traditions as 2.5 centuries of relative stability had led the country to believe. The guardrails that held were not made of steel. They were made of agreement, of collective respect for boundaries that existed not in any statute, but in the shared judgment of the people who held power and chose, generation after generation, not to abuse it. That agreement was broken today, and broken agreements, unlike broken laws, do not come with a clear mechanism for repair. What also became clear today is that the consequences of this moment are not confined to any single branch of government, any single news cycle, or any single term of office. The legal system is already absorbing the shockwave. The legislative branch is being forced toward decisions it has avoided for years. Foreign governments are quietly revising their assessments of American institutional reliability. And the American public, already worn down by years of political turbulence, already skeptical of institutions that have repeatedly failed to meet the ideals they claim to represent, is being asked to process something that does not fit neatly into any of the existing frameworks they use to make sense of their government. That processing will take time. It always does. The full meaning of a historic action is never available on the day it happens. The people who lived through the most consequential moments in American history, the expansion of executive war powers, the normalization of executive orders as a primary governing tool, the gradual erosion of congressional authority over decades of institutional drift, rarely understood in real time what they were witnessing. They felt the disturbance. They argued about it. They filed their lawsuits and cast their votes and wrote their editorials. But the full picture only assembled itself in retrospect, when enough time had passed to see not just the action but its consequences, not just the decision but the world it created. What is different today, what makes this particular moment harder to sit with than most, is the speed at which the consequences are already making themselves visible. Usually, the ripple effects of a presidential precedent take years to fully emerge. Today, they are arriving in hours. The court filings, the foreign government responses, the congressional pressure, the public reaction. All of it is compressed into a timeline that does not allow for the comfortable distance of historical perspective. America is being asked to understand the significance of what happened before it has even had time to fully confirm the facts of what happened. And that compression, that collapse of the space between action and consequence, is itself a sign of how profoundly today's events have disturbed the normal functioning of the system. And so the country stands here at the end of a day that began like any other and ends like very few in living memory, holding a set of questions that have no easy answers. Questions about the limits of executive power and who is ultimately responsible for enforcing them. Questions about the health of institutions that were designed for a different era, facing pressures their architects never imagined. Questions about what is owed to the traditions that built this democracy and what is owed to the democratic will of the people who live inside it. Questions about how a nation recalibrates after a line has been crossed, when the crossing itself has changed the definition of where the line was. These are not questions with comfortable answers. They are not questions that resolve in a single court ruling or a single election. They are the kinds of questions that a country carries with it forward, that shape policy and culture and political behavior across years and administrations and generations, that define not just what a nation does, but what it believes about itself. History did not wait for permission to happen today. And America, whether it is ready or not, will never be the same.